Well, welcome back to another Whiskey Wednesday with Binny's Beverage Depot. I'm Pat from the Whiskey Hotline with Joe and Brett. Our special guest this week is Freddie Noe. Freddie is the what generation distiller now?
Eighth generation.
Eighth generation. It's there's all these statistics you read about how family businesses fail after 2 or 3 generations or something. So doing pretty good there at the eighth. So, Freddie, you're kind of in charge of a lot of the innovation and stuff, and you guys have a kind of craftier arm. You've been doing some really cool releases with the Little Book series, all that. I don't know. Where do you want to start? I guess with we're here to talk about Basil Toast, but
Yeah.
what was the most recent thing you made over there? Let's hear about that.
Most recent thing I made. I've been working on the latest chapter, Little Book Chapter 6. So unfortunately, I won't be able to tell you too much about that. I say latest. The next chapter will be next year.
Okay.
So yeah, but doing a lot of blending with that. To be honest, I put some barrels into a trial, pulled them out of regular production, and have been kind of doing some blending with it. So can't tell too much about it because it's still very, very early on, but that's a lot of what I've been working on here lately is some stuff with Little Book. And then we actually are kicking off a craft distillery. So we're talking about doing quite a bit of different new production there at the distillery. So a lot of that stuff, maybe some variations of different grains, which kind of plays in with Basil Toast, where we've brought back a mash bill we utilized about 12 or 13 years ago. Well, actually a little bit longer than that now. It'd probably be about almost 18 years ago. We made a distillation with brown rice instead of rye. And then after it aged out, we were all very pleased with how the whiskey tasted, mainly through a lot of its aging up to about 13 years old is what we bottled it at. And the signature craft line, I don't know if you guys remember that.
Yeah, we sold those. We were big fans of that brown rice one.
I think it came out 2014, I believe. Maybe don't quote me on
Seems
the year, but somewhere
right.
around there. Yeah.
Ballpark 7
And so,
years ago, yeah.
Yeah, so we kind of earmarked that one as one that was, at least something that we would want to maybe go back to and check out. And that's kind of where an opportunity came to distill it. And I had just became in the distillery team, actually. So I've kind of been around this liquid really since its infancy, I've said. So then you kind of fast forward, 5 years later after we've distilled it, and we're talking about, doing a release on Basil Hayden. And I just knew from my working with the whiskey, it's a little bit softer than the rye. Definitely, you don't get a lot of that spice that comes through in the back of your palate when you utilize rye a little bit. But, thinking towards Basil Hayden and kind of the things we've done there lately by utilizing different barrels to bring out flavor, I thought it was a good opportunity as we've worked with our partner at Independent Stave and Barrel Maker to do a process where you toast the barrel prior to charring it to really kind of hone in on specific flavors that maybe are a little bit differentiated from just that charred barrel. So that's kind of where it started. We did a trial of a few different toast profiles, and the one we landed on obviously ended up being in Basil Hayden Toast. I think to me it was very, very pleasing. I think the one thing about it too is a lot of the flavor that comes out is some of the confectionery sweets, some of the soft vanillas and soft caramels, some of the more well-received flavors in whiskey. So
now, was anything else different about the barrel with this? Were the staves air dried or cured for a different amount of time? Or is this kind of the same spec that you're using for most of these other barrels? You just added a toast to it.
I believe we did have a little bit longer seasoning on these barrel staves as well. Typically, we utilize like a 12-month seasoning, I guess a 2 summers, sort of season through 2 full summers, which is a little over a year, I guess you would say. These went a little bit longer, right at about 18 months, I believe. So you get a little bit differentiation coming from the wood, right, as it kind of dries out, ages differently. And then the toasting of the barrel also. I think that's what's really good is that brown rice bourbon was very complementary in its first barrel, aging in that char 1 barrel, which is what it did for that 5 years there, or close to 5 years there. And with that, you get a lot more flavor from the barrel at a younger age, I think, coming and kind of making a little bit more rounded bourbon. And then when we put this into that second cask, knowing that it already kind of was very receptive to flavor, it just really took on to this toasted barrel as well. And I think it was a very great compliment for the Basil Hayden line, knowing that we like to kind of welcome folks to bourbon with Basil Hayden.
Yeah.
And like I said, very approachable with the palate on it. Some of our other releases as well, with like the dark rye, even Caribbean rye we did as well.
Yeah, I've always kind of found that interesting with basil, where it's so soft and approachable, yet it was always traditionally the higher rye mash bill, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. So with these, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, because I'm jumping out because I was just curious, and so now we know that you've resurrected some things now that you've been involved with brown rice. Have you done anything else with triticale or rolled oats?
I'll be honest, it's this one, at that time, it was the first thing we had actually done different as a mash bill. As you guys know, we did the Booker's Rye run, and then we have been making some more of that. So then this one really is the first kind of, we took it from a trial period, as that first run was, into production. So this is really the first recipe that we did that with, and we did not strike back on any of those other ones yet. I'll say yet because some of those were very interesting, and especially as was mentioned earlier with my brand Little Book that I've been doing the blending on, some of those things could be very interesting when you start talking about that, because Little Book is about exploration of whiskey, and then also things like this with Basil Hayden and our other brands. There's opportunities to bring differentiation of flavor to light in different ways. Unfortunately, no, I will say we have looked at some other grains, though, so you might be on the lookout in the maybe near future for something different in the grain category to come. But this is the first, and this is kind of the first kind of stab at stepping away and doing a new mash bill on a kind of permanent run here.
You know what nobody's done too, which you ought to think about, because if you add in, nobody's ever done a 7 grain. Write this down. Nobody's ever done a 7 grain.
I'll tell you why. The complications of mashing that and holding the grains separate and getting them grinded would be
crazy,
man.
Well, I would wonder whether you get like diminishing returns from each. And then you're right, because for folks who've been through distillery, if when you're doing a mash, the corn goes in and it doesn't sting for a while, and with a very, very tiny amount of malt, and then the rye goes in, then the malt goes in last, because you need to have all the temperatures right and holding periods right and all that. So now if you add in the other 3 grains being rice, oats, and triticale, which is actually just a wheat strain anyway, along with wheat. How long? I mean, when does where does rice go in? Where does rice?
It'd be where you talk about rye. When you talk about the rye drop, so when we're making a bourbon, you would essentially use your same kind of cook profile to kind of accentuate the flavors of your cooking, right?
Okay.
So we do the same process, cook up, like you just mentioned there, corn with a bit of pre-malt, as we call it, and you heat it up. And then as your temperature is coming back down, that's where you would interject your what we call flavor grain. So if we were doing variation on bourbon, typically it would come in around that same temperature that rye would come in on a bourbon drop.
Which is like around 180 or something?
Yep.
Yeah.
You got it right there. Really, anything under 190 is what you could do. It's kind of what your preference is as a distiller. Really, there's different. I mean, it's kind of like cooking, just cooking in general at different temperatures, high heat, long, short time versus lower heat for a longer time. You can take the same cut of meat and make a very differentiated profile there, cooking 2 separate ways. Very similar with cooking, but You're right in that area, anywhere under about 190, 188, down to about 180 is where it typically comes in at. So very similar process for there. And then for this one, it was a very similar distillation process that we use just for our standard Jim Beam. So a little bit different than what we were doing for the old Granddad and Basil line. So this is a totally new line for us.
So, and then so you said, so you're running the stills differently as well.
Just a little bit. So we've got, we have what we call a continuous column distillation, but we have certain vessels throughout, like a converter. We use a different level to check when we change look at changing proof. You can utilize that. We have retention tanks, kind of like, we call them a little bit like a fat pipe. So for each of our products, they run a little bit differently. If we're running different proofs, we may adjust the proof differently based on some of those different vessels, and then also temperature on the column as well. So a little bit different than what we do on our other productions.
Does it ferment any differently with this rice, or is it a pretty standard?
It's a really good fermentation, actually, because if you think about it, what's great and why corn is the predominant grain in bourbon, it's predominantly starch. Well, what's got more starch in it than corn? Rice. So when you replace the rye with this rice, you're I was kind of getting ahead of myself there in my storytelling. The rice helps actually make a little bit more whiskey. It's got a little more starch content than, for sure, and corn. And then because of that, it's a good environment for fermentation. As long as you have, set it up where you've got good conversion and stuff, everything goes great.
So does it ultimately make more alcohol or go faster, or both?
It just makes a little bit more. It doesn't go faster. I mean, basically that's a temperature thing. You can set a different temperature and ferment a different time frame, shorter or longer based on your set temp. But it just mainly makes a little bit more alcohol.
Interesting change. So, so no 7 grain.
No 7 grain
coming up.
I'd get blown out the door if I walked back in. Say I go into the distillery tomorrow.
You could do the 7 grains separately, like our neighbors.
That's what I was going to say.
And then blend
the
it
one
after.
thing you could do is do a 3 grain and then do a 4 grain, and then make a blend. You could do that. I think we could pull a 7 grain off that way, but they'd be trying to kick me down the staircase if I said, "Hey, we're going to run 7 grains in one mash." It ain't going to happen. I'd like to see the look on whoever's doing the mashing at any distillery if you walk in the door and tell them we're going to do a 7 grain mash and see what happens.
Well, and it's big, and people understand. I mean, you have big stills, so any experiment you do isn't really a small experiment. I mean, to make it worthwhile, you've got to have something to charge that still just to pay for the gas to turn it on.
The one thing too is we actually have just started production on a new smaller facility that's running about roughly 70 barrels a day. It'll run some more of our ultra premium bourbons, but also give us some time for that experimentation. This was experimentation. As I kind of said, we kind of donned it as our first kind of line extension mash bill wise after we ran it, but it started as a very calculated experimentation based on one that, we had previously done with that signature craft line. So like you said, it was a very, like I said, very calculated, because it was, having to make and getting time on the still to do experimentation when you have brands that justify and command the time is a tricky one as well. You're taking away from making others when you're doing things of experimentation nature. So our new facility, named after my dad, right there on our Claremont campus, will give us the opportunity to do some grain research, fermentation research. There's quite a bit of stuff we'll be doing as we look at kind of the future of American whiskey. So it's pretty exciting. And to your point, I'm glad you kind of queued that up. it gives us an opportunity to do it on a little bit smaller scale because, we spent quite a bit of time growing, over the last 225 years. And then when you start talking about doing research and stuff, that's usually on a very small scale. So it's kind of us taking a little bit of a step back.
And it would have always
70
been
barrels a day, though, is
right.
a monstrous scale for almost anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, and it would have been, and all of these things would have been done at Claremont, not at Boston, even on the big stills. You were doing all that at Claremont, not at Boston.
That's correct. That's correct.
Speaking of Claremont, so we traveled down there quite a bit, and we couldn't help but notice that just gigantic rick house that got built, like 2 years ago or something now, the one right up close to the road. How many barrels are in that warehouse?
It's full. It sits right at 50,000, just a little bit under 50,000.
That is crazy. It's got to be the biggest rick house I've ever seen.
I think it's just perspective on where it's sitting. It's no different than any you'll see that have been built by the kind of big distilleries in the last few years. If you go Bardstown Road, Heaven Hill's got about 6 or 7, or maybe that you can visibly see. All same size. Ours are basically, our older ones are about 20,000, and then the newer ones are right at about 50,000.
Wow.
And then where are you? Because, with the amount of production you have to be building, are you still building around the Claremont campus, or are you building in other parts of
both of our campuses, just our 2 campuses at Claremont and Booker Noe or Boston. That's the 2 spots where we're building at.
Okay. So you got to.
We do have a warehouse location. We're always looking at property locations if we can, and we always have been. We've got areas where we have water holding reservoirs, places that really is kind of free for wildlife, actually, as well. But we like the backup water, so always looking for land if we can get our hands that's connected to our distilleries. It helps improve the quality of our water if we can kind of watch over our, as much of the watershed around us as we can. Our good thing is too, we got a good neighbor in on the south of Claremont is Bernheim, and on the north of Boston is Bernheim. So there's not a lot of land. There's some, but there's not. When you start talking about how big Bernheim is, there's not a lot that's there. But the good thing is, all of our water runoff is coming from mostly Bernheim forest and their watershed. So,
and that wasn't there some word that they were trying to do something in some kind of development in Bernheim? Has there been a fight over trying to do some things in there in the Bernheim forest?
It's all around, it's across everywhere across America. I think it has to do with the gas pipeline, I believe. They're trying to run gas through a piece of property they've purchased, I believe, something like that. I'm not 100% sure on all the logistics of it, but yeah.
Yeah, it's always a fight on that.
Yeah.
So back to the toast, I guess. Joe had an interesting comment when we first started tasting this, where he thought it kind of just drank like a real soft, pleasant weeder. I mean, where do you land on this, and as far as profile with your other brands that you've blended or worked on?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that it categorizes. We don't have outside of our sister distillery and makers, we don't have weeded bourbon or whiskey that we have made. But yeah, I would say that's probably it probably lands a little bit closer there than it does with rye. Mainly, like I said, a little bit higher starch content. There's not a lot of starch, doesn't add a lot of flavor, and rice is very high content of starch. So essentially it's a very kind of neutral grain. And as you eat, I'm sure you guys have ate rice, if you don't do anything to it, it's kind of just very bland taste. So yeah, that's a lot of it. And like I said, just how it reacted with the barrel, I would say it landed pretty close. That's a pretty good, accurate description, just based on that. In our portfolio, like I said, we don't have much to compare. The closest comparison I would probably give back would be, it might still be just Basil. It might be the regular Basil, just based on kind of approachability and things. But basil does have just a little bit of that spice where this doesn't. It doesn't hit that. It's so that's a pretty good, accurate description, I'd say.
Well, like wheat,
And
I mean,
especially
wheat
from
just
a
kind
grain
of,
breakdown. Yep.
yeah, wheat just tends to stay out of the way, I think, and let the other grains do the talking. So if this is just starch and not a lot of flavor, it makes sense.
Well, the other example I use too when I think about that is we've tasted through a number of rice whiskeys that are just straight rice. And it always seems that whatever barrel that they've been matured in, they end up taking on that characteristic. So for me, that rice kind of operated similar to the wheat, but almost a little bit more out of the way and a little fatter texture where the corn gets to shine. And then the spice that you do get is coming from that toasted oak, which is nice.
Yeah, to your other flavors of bourbon, for say in this instance, you take out the rye, and then also the complementary of the barrel, I think, which is very critical, especially when you're talking about doing a second aging in a finished cask here. And then because of that, when you do that, it brings out even more flavor from that secondary finished cask as well, I believe. So it worked out well. I think when we first distilled it, we were very pleased with how it went. And as it's aged, it's turned into a pretty complimentary whiskey. And then, as you see here, with a secondary finish with a toasted barrel, it lands very nice as well.
Yeah, and it's now I noticed that it's got the new bottle. Is this what all the other ones are going to? Something that has bugged me for a long time as someone who's stocked a lot of Basil Hayden on the shelves in our store. It used to kill me, man. Opening all those cases and pulling bottles out of single-use plastic, put them on the shelf just to keep the label and the metal nice. And for as much as Basil as we sold, that I thought that was just. I mean, that was a killer, man, with that plastic. And I noticed with this one, it's coming in cases that don't have the plastic bag in them anymore.
That's correct. That plastic bag was to help. If you remember the old one, it had the label had the kind of shoulder. We called it a bib that went up. That was the point, was to protect that from getting nicked in the box, but it didn't work very well. I mean, I picked up plenty of bottles. That was the main reason for the changes. We implemented it to try to fix, a problem we had, and it didn't work out very well. You still could pull them out with crinkled labels, or to your point, the band would maybe catch on the bag and then you kind of bend back. So really, we looked at the packaging, and I'm extremely pleased with it. But yes,
it's great.
A little bit of inform. Obviously, it won't have the kind of as that toast label has that kind of. I'm looking at it, that kind of like toasted look as it goes up. It won't have that, but the top portion, yes, is very similar to the rest of the basil. And then the side little hang tag with the tasting notes and a little bit about it will also be there as well.
That's good. That's a positive change. I mean, sounds like for the brand and for the environmental concerns too.
I knew when you said that old basil, I figured there was going to be a complaint about the bag, or that because of the bag, there's crinkling. I was going to say, well, the bag was supposed to help the crinkling, but no, it wasn't a good fix. And we kind of went back to the drawing board, and voila, you'll see it kind of rolling out pretty soon.
All right. We got a question here from one of our attendees.
Okay.
Is what's the unicorn bourbon that you save for a special occasion?
I'll tell you what, that one I mentioned is not a bourbon at the beginning. I'll tell you what, really any of like the Booker's Rye, obviously, Booker's 25th, and then the Booker's 30th. I really like to kind of go back from time to time and just have a sip of those, because those were some of the first projects that my dad included me on when I was first getting started in the business. As Granddaddy had passed, and I guess he kind of wanted someone else's opinion on it, close, to the whiskey. So I enjoyed being able to work with Dad on projects a little bit and get my feet wet. As you all see, I enjoy working on kind of the creative side of things. So it was kind of him appeasing me a little bit, I'm sure, but also kind of helping him out. So I think those are good ones whenever you're, maybe kicking off a new project, or maybe just kicked off a project and are looking for some inspiration. Those whiskeys are good ones to kind of go to and get good answers from, I think, and at least kind of mull over things. There's a lot of good flavor in what we did in those. So, and like I said, there's a little nostalgia there being some of the early stuff, but talking unicorn whiskey, I'd say that, or maybe even Little Book Chapter 1, you know, at this point, 5 years later, if I'm working on Little Book, I may go back, just, you know, and taste comparative and look at my notes and kind of go through things. So, yeah,
Yeah, they
really,
certainly
I'd say
qualify as unicorns at this
Well,
day.
do you ever?
Oh, yeah.
Well, and do you ever get back into? And I don't even know how much you guys would have archived. You know, talking about experimentation. What your grandfather, one of your grandfather's most prominent experiments were the Distiller's masterpieces from the
Oh,
late
yeah.
'90s, where they did the, you know, before TTB came to their senses and allowed you to finish bourbon and still call it bourbon. I mean, he was finishing bourbon that then had to be
Pretty
called
much.
just whiskey, American whiskey, in the old Fusini cognac barrels and the Geyser Peak port barrels. Do you ever get a chance to go back and
Oh, yeah.
play with that, or think about doing any riffs on that, which your grandfather did, what, 30 years ago almost now?
So we did a
20
release of a masterpiece that was similar, not quite maybe an exclusive of the barrels used, but that was available at our gift shop. We have since kind of stopped production, but there might be an opportunity. He was using some really old whiskey that he had made and then I think sold to a customer. Then the customer ended up not wanting to bottle it, and then sold it back to him. And it was like, when he got it back, I think it was 16 years old, and you know, in the early '90s, that was unheard of. It just wasn't a palate for that, really. To be quite honest, there was no palate for that whiskey, and so he did a pretty magical thing there, bringing in that barrel finishing, like you said, well before it was allowed. I'm not going to say we won't ever do it again, but he had a really cool story there, in knowing the guys that were making the wine and making, you know, getting that cognac barrel. So, you know, if I stumble across something that's what, you know, it's got to be something connective to it. It's just not just doing things because granddaddy did them for me, you know. But yeah, there could be an opportunity to do something. And I'd say if we do something like that, it could probably fall back into that, you know, into that Distiller's masterpiece. Possibly, who knows? But I haven't tasted. I've tasted the one with the Eau de Fusine barrels, but I haven't tasted the Geyser Peak one. Only but one time, because we don't actually have a bottle of it. You talk about archive. We don't actually have a bottle of the Geyser Peak version at the house that I know of, unless Dad's hiding it from me. That's unless. But he shared most everything else, so it'd be something that he's hiding very, very tight on. So,
And
Check
see,
the ham smoking shack. Could be in there.
yeah. Well, I actually cleaned that out not too long ago and found some old wine that Granddaddy made. We still had decanted, and he's been passed, you know, at this point almost 18 years. So yeah, it could have been in there, but recently I cleaned it out to get it into some better cleaned up shape so we could put some more hams in there, actually.
speaking of which, well, there's one more question before we get to the hams,
Yeah.
because we can't have a discussion with you or your father without talking about country ham.
True.
It's like two things, you know. One, it was the era. It's the sad thing, when your grandfather would have done those experiments in that area, you wouldn't find any, because people actually drank bourbon then.
Right.
They didn't put it down and try to watch it appreciate in value and resell it to other people. If they bought bourbon, they were buying it to drink it, not to sit on a mantle. There was another
Especially
question,
at that
curious,
high price point too.
Yeah.
right? Because that was a couple $100
Yeah.
30 years ago.
I think so.
I mean, I think we sold it for $200, which
Right.
was unheard of. Nothing. I mean, that's when Pappy 23 was still 120, 130.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that was even commanding a premium to Pappy 23. We did have another question, which we'll bring out, and of course, and I think they put it wrong. They're talking about the Beam family being involved in multiple distilleries in Kentucky. What's the bourbon selection like at the, you know, if all the Beams that are making bourbon in Kentucky right now showed up with something, what's the bourbon selection like?
I think it's pretty good. I mean, if you look at the kind of spread of our family across the industry, you know, I think it's pretty good. I think we'd have a pretty good table there, you know. The good thing is you got people going at it differently. You know, we were talking about cook profiles on mashing. You know, not everyone's there trying to make Jim Beam, right? You got the guys making Yellowstone and Steve Beam. They're doing great things, so, and doing it different than what we're doing, and the flavor that's presented is different as well. So that's what's really cool is you got a lot of family members, same family, maybe coming in from different areas of the lineage and branching out, but all very rooted in high quality bourbon making. And I think you can see that. And if we all got together, I think you'd have a table of high quality bourbon sitting there.
And it's amazing if you really go back. I can't think of another industry that has so many people tied. If you go back 8 to 10 generations, that has so many people tied that have gone in so many different directions. It's pretty amazing.
I think it's one thing Granddaddy always said is, the industry is a great opportunity if you want to come in, and it's good to a lot of people. And I'm sure that was probably a saying that was passed down through the family, and I think anybody that touches the industry, I think you quickly understand that there's kind of like this unwritten thing about it. There's a lot of passion involved. There's a lot of friendship that gets developed very quickly. I mean, even down to you guys, you're far removed from my guys sitting at the stills making this stuff, but you're still connected to the industry. And I think you see that when you talk to the different distillers, and you guys, selling our products. It's just a passion for whiskey, and it goes all the way from the stillman all the way, to the salesman. I think it really does. And especially when you're so close to it at being at, a Beam family making it. I think once, if you hear that from your dad and you kind of go to the distillery, it's almost always going to represent whatever you've been told about it, because it is a very great industry to be a part of.
Okay, now on to the second best thing that the Noe family produces. Let's talk about, so when are you guys making country ham this year?
So we haven't decided just yet, but we usually do it maybe like 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, right there, right before the Christmas holiday, because you got to do it around, you want it to be right at 32 degrees outside, but you don't want it to be where it dips really low before your hams get cured, because as the water is that's what curing is, you put salt on and pulls the water out. The ham could freeze prior to it getting cured, and then you wouldn't even know it, and you hang it, and a few months later after it thaws out is when it would rot. So you got to hit it just perfect. You can't have it too warm where the meat would rot if you're curing it, but you don't want it so cold that it would freeze, because we're working in ambient air. We don't have heating and air there. It's the old traditional. The house was built in 1820, and I'm pretty sure the smokehouse was built probably very close with it. So we do it then, and then we let them we let them cure for about 21 days, and then we hang them, and we'll get one down at Easter time. So that'll be the first one, and then we'll kind of go through the rest of the year. We actually only got one left from last year, so I'm ready to get some more hams hanging.
And how many are you making this year?
That's a good question. So we went down to 4 last year because we had a couple left over from the year before, so we thought we had too many. But then we ended up kind of going through those a little bit quicker. Probably 8. I'd say we'll probably do 8 at least.
Well, we can probably, if you don't ever think that you're going to have a ham left over, because amongst other things, because one of the things we do in fact, your father told us to go to Old Delaney's, which is how
he turned us on to one of our favorite shops for ham and pickled things. And we stop every time we're around. Yeah.
We'll also periodically go to the gun company, get Keens, which are great hams.
Yeah, they're good too. Yeah, that's two good ones.
And then the Penn Valley, of course, Boone's, which I'm guessing is where you get the pork loins, right?
Yeah, we get the ham down there. Yep. Fresh.
So, and have you ever aged anything longer? Because just for previous ham purchases, we have two-year-old hams hanging at a distillery in California, at a brandy distillery. So we're trying to see if we can get that conversion to go to something more like prosciutto.
Oh, you got it. You're there. You're just, it's kind of about I've talked to some ham curing guys recently about it. it's kind of about the environment in which it's kind of hanging in. We let them go 2 years. They get a little bit tough. The summer here kind of dries them out a little bit more. But if you could get one good summer and then maybe store them inside, you could definitely get some more age on them. They just start to get hard, really hard. And then you lose a lot of your yield, right? You can't, a lot of it you got to trim away. It kind of flakes away. But 18 months is kind of like that sweet spot for, I think, for our ham hanging purposes. If you go much longer than that, you start to lose a little too much of that crumbliness and drying out. Younger than that's good. I think anything 8-month cure to 18 month, but 18 month you get that good saltiness. I think it's
And it's like, so your house is pretty much open and in the middle of, on one of the main drags going into Bardstown is pretty open. Do you worry more about having the liquor cabinet raided or the ham smoker raided?
I'll tell you what, I'm probably more worried about the ham. A lot of people in the community have heard of our hams, and we've given them some out. So if they knew what time of year it was and when it might be right, the padlock on the ham door might be a little bit more secure, or a place to be trying to have secure than the liquor cabinet. Especially, like I said, you get a couple of them 14, 18-month-old hams hanging in there. You put a lot of time and effort. That's equivalent to an 8-9-year-old bourbon, at least, I'd say, so
we finally drawn a line between ham age and bourbon age.
That's right.
Well,
that's right.
Well, here, and so for people don't understand, what is the work involved in curing? Because in getting that, what is involved in taking what's essentially like a shank of pork?
Yep.
And
basically just
curing.
Salt, really just covered in curing salt. And that salt pulls all the moisture out of it. And that's what it is. And then after about 21 days, it's pretty well, the salt has gone away, absorbed into the meat, and it's cured. And then we hang it. And then at that point, you're just letting any additional kind of juice or water that's left will kind of drip out of it. And at that point, it can be eaten as cured meat. And you can either cook it, or you can just eat it like you say, like prosciutto at that point. But then obviously the aging process, it brings out different flavors. And yeah, so it's kind of really, that's it. Just, it's making sure you got you don't want to use meat that's been sitting a while that kind of looks like gummy, kind of pasty. You got to have a good fresh, so you got to kind of skin, even after we get them, we skin them down, skin a layer of the meat off so that it's very fresh, so that the salt takes through.
We were at Old Delaney's last month, and they had a sign up that there was a country ham shortage, and they weren't selling whole country hams anymore for the time being. And that was the first true COVID economic shortage that I think really affected me personally.
And that was a little bit of a tease, because he had a half a dozen pens hanging there. He had a half a dozen,
and with a sign saying you couldn't buy a whole one.
With a sign said you couldn't buy one.
Isn't that when we bought out Boone's of the pimento cheese too?
We've also cleaned out
pimento cheese is on back order of Boone's.
Dang, y'all are
in charge of the great
Bardstown shortage. Y'all come down. That's what I was gonna say. Y'all gotta let me know before y'all come down next time. I'm gonna have to run around and make some stock ups. So it seems like y'all are draining the Bardstown's finest.
Have you ever tried smoking ham over used barrel staves? That was a question we got here.
Oh yeah, all the time. I use barrel staves to kind of get a hot fire. Barrel staves don't do good for smoking because they're saturated with whiskey, right? And it's flammable. Alcohol is flammable. But they do a hell of a job getting a fire going. So I use the staves to kind of get them going with some charcoal. And then we'll use oak, which is very similar to barrel, same stature. Just hadn't had whiskey in it. But you want to soak it in water and get it, where it smolders real good and long, because you don't want it to be hot. You want it to stay, you want to be able to walk in there where we're smoking them, because you don't want that meat to cook, right? You want it to just grab the smoke and continue to cure, but not cook, because then you have to preserve it in the fridge, and then it's gone. So typically I don't use them just because of that reason. I'll use it to get them going, because if you get a little bit too hot, it's easier to make a fire warmer. It's a hell of a lot harder to cool it down in that smokehouse once you get it up to a pretty warm temperature. So
Yeah.
I use them at the beginning to get it going, but typically we use just whole chunks of wood that have been kind of soaked in water to get that good smoke.
Did that answer all your ham questions, Brett?
Somewhere there's a Suntory executive that's losing his mind. Why are they talking about him?
No, they're good. They know it, it just all goes as part of it. If you're talking with us, there's a lot of storytelling involved. There's whiskey drinking, there's ham, maybe some beaten biscuit stories as well. It goes very well with ham.
Yeah, we recorded a podcast a couple years ago with your dad, and our marketing guy was pulling his hair out because after like 2 hours of recorded footage, there was like 15 minutes about whiskey and an hour and a half about ham.
Hey, ham is, you get talking about ham, you
That's
go off on a tangent now.
That's where we found out about Old Delaney's.
Yeah. See, that's where
we're recording that.
Go. There you go.
So what is next for Basil here? I mean, you alluded that this was going to be around regularly. I know we got a limited amount. Everybody landed at your local Binny's today, went everywhere. Brett, can you look up what we're selling that for in that computer in front of you? I know it was just coming in today, but it was kind of limited though, so I wasn't sure if we were going to be able to really brag that we had this that much.
$50.
$50. So Freddie's just going to be around?
Readily available, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep, it's going to be around. It's what we're calling a permanent line extension. So
okay, cool.
Should be.
We're getting an okay chunk. We'll get through the weekend at least.
Mm-hmm.
For everybody, maybe.
And we sell a lot of basils, that's for sure.
Yeah, so any other more limited, like, Caribbean rye and things like that, are there other little experiments? It's nice. It's got to be a nice thing about Basil now. You sort of have turned it into your brand name that you can go in a lot of different directions, right? You don't really, if you want to make Booker's is going to be Booker's.
Oh, yeah.
Baker's is going to be Baker's, right? And Knob is going to be Knob, but now you've got some, maybe some finishing on Knob. But you've got some bandwidth to do some other things, I think, with Basil.
We got some bandwidth on those other ones. I'm not going to let we got some things coming, but it'll be some time on some of it. You got to, when you talk about some of that stuff, you got to really make sure that it's right for the brand. You can lay things down from grain to all that, but if it ends up not really fitting into what your brand story is about, then it doesn't amount to much. But with this one, I'll be honest, what's coming on Basil is this is what I've been working on. So it's not a lot else kind of in the hopper currently at the moment. I've just been looking to roll this one out, but there's some other things coming on some of our other brands in the coming year, I would say, as well. But to your point, with Basil, we've used it to kind of go a little bit wider because of sitting at 80 proof, kind of welcoming folks to the industry, and hopefully bringing folks from some of those other categories to try bourbon. As you mentioned with the Caribbean Reserve Rye, hopefully bringing in some rum drinkers to try bourbon and see that that maybe it does please their palate. So that's what we use Basil for. Is one to kind of welcome folks to the industry, use a little bit more of that exploration of barrel finishing, things along that nature.
So we've got a couple questions. Is Old Tub coming back?
Ooh, I can't answer that one. I don't believe so. I don't believe it's coming anytime soon. If it is coming, I mean, I'm not going to say is it coming back. That's a loaded question. I would have said if you could have asked them from 78 or so to up until probably maybe 6 years ago, and everybody would have said no. So that it wasn't coming back. I'm not going to say that it isn't coming back, but yeah.
Well, and the corollary to that, of course, is what's happening, because there were heavy rumors that Sunnybrook was possibly going to make an appearance, and
where'd that rumor come from? That's funny.
So I mean, we started it.
I was gonna say you probably definitely started it because I haven't heard it, and I haven't. It definitely hasn't been mentioned in any Beam meetings either. So that's definitely a full rumor right there.
So we're pushing. We've made the request that if it does, we would be happy to do the exclusive national launch of it if Sunnybrook ever came back.
All right.
So, and so somebody else wanted to know if how involved is Fred still in the business, and has he transitioning to the porch chair and giving the keys to you?
I'll still take him a lot of samples. He's transitioning closer to the chair, I'd say. He's not fully there. But, you know, with COVID and stuff going on, he has kind of stepped aside a little bit. You know, I still keep him very, very connected. He's still involved in meetings and things. But as far as day-to-day, he's kind of stepped back a little bit. Yeah. But he's definitely fully involved. He's been involved in the development of, you know, even though I worked on Toast, obviously I let him have a taste of it, of some of the final prototypes. Yeah, but he's doing good. But yes, he's definitely he's getting closer. He's getting closer to the chair. I don't know if, you know, wanting to get closer to the chair. I think I don't know if he is or not yet, but he's thinking about it anyway.
Fred Mercury here suggests that we try Suriano ham from Virginia, which is similar to Iberico, fed on acorns, finished on peanuts. If we can find it, we will try it because we have not met a ham we haven't tried.
I'll tell you what, you can get on, Edwards Hams. They've got Suriano hams. They're a Virginia-based ham maker. I'm actually doing an event with them. I've done one before as well, where we pair some whiskey with some different aged hams, like a 3-month, an 8-month, and a 12-month cure.
Beam Suntory marketing people who are listening, that's the only marketing event we will ever entertain going forward around these bourbon brands, so you're aware. You know, that we're laying that down now.
Yeah, those check about Edwards Ham. I think they got a website. You can just order it straight off of there. You have to check it out. But I have had that. That is very good ham. That's a good recommendation.
Ordering a ham as we speak. That looks as I am looking at
Edwards Hams Shop. That is awesome. Surrey, Virginia.
See, you brought up ham and you got even more. You thought Old Delaney's
our time
was
with
good.
The Noe family always leads us to ham.
Well, now that I know ham and bourbon pairing is a potential event, you know, that's as soon as we can have in-person events, as soon as we get done with these virtual events, it's going to be ham and bourbon pairing. Make it happen. Friendly marketing guy, Steve.
Yeah, exactly.
Put
that on the list.
We can't even get through what we're doing right now, and they're already talking about doing something else. We're making him work a little too hard.
Well, Freddie, we really appreciate your time tonight, man. I know it's you got a busy schedule here, talking about all this stuff. So appreciate it. This toast is awesome. You know, Basil has always been that approachable, easy drinking, new bourbon kind of drinker brand, and I think this is a little more. I don't know. It's fuller bodied to me almost. You know, even though it's only 80 proof, it's a rich bourbon. I'm a big fan of it. Get it at your local Binny's. Going to be around, regularly available. So, yeah, that's all we got to say about that. Freddie, thank you again, man.
Yeah.
Everybody else.
Great chatting with you guys again.
Yeah, for sure. Everybody else, we'll probably be back next Wednesday. I think we got Journeyman Distilling on next Wednesday. So,
yep.
Freddie, thanks a lot, man. Appreciate it. We're looking forward to our ham pairing in the future.
Cheers, brother. Yeah. Let me know how that goes.
All right.
All right, everyone. Have a good night. Thanks.
Take care.